Join me in welcoming Lord Lamont. Thank you very much for coming. Can I just show how many people first time here? Right, still quite a lot, so please tell people to come here more. As you can see from the leaflet, we've got very exceptional people here doing these 1 hour talk, and the idea is to let you, the audience, have a say with questions and answers, which I hope Lord Lamont will entertain. And essentially, I've simply asked our guest speaker to say anything they want, and I will lead the speaker into one or two other questions, and then I'm going to hand it over to you. When I asked Lord Lamont to come, he said, well, what should I talk about? I said, well, you've got such a rich history and such an exceptional life, you can talk about anything you want, but I might have one or two questions about his life. But the hot subject is Brexit, of course, and I don't know whether you know, but Lord Lamont is a proponent of out, although, according to the bookies, the Remain is going to win. Anyway, those of you who are in or out can ask Norman questions as you wish. But Norman, do you want to just start off by talking about Brexit, or do you want to talk about your extraordinary life and some of the most extraordinary people, most of whom, because they're sort of middle-aged, would know who you're talking about? I'm talking about Kenneth Clark. There has been, but still household names like Major and Heseltine. We'd love for you to spill a few beans and be indiscreet and tell us what these people are like, because we always have impressions of people. I mean, sometimes we hate them, but when we actually meet them in the flesh, they are incredibly nice. Or the other way around, thinking that somebody is incredibly nice, and you meet them and they're absolutely complete horrible people. In your life, have you met more horrible people in politics or good people?
No, I would say in politics, people actually are surprisingly, this would be surprising to other people, straightforward. I always say the politics of business are 100 times more horrible than the politics of politics. In politics, people actually have something at stake, they have ideas, they have things they wish to argue for. That's why people fall out with each other. It's why people make alliances with each other. It's why you get political dining clubs, people who share the same ideas and who make little cabals together. Politics is about fighting for ideas. But you asked about people. Well, I could talk about any of the people you mentioned, but I think the most appropriate person to mention would be having had the privilege of being in Mrs. Thatcher's government. People are always asking me, what was Mrs. Thatcher like? Well, I always remember what Bernard Shaw said, which was that progress depends upon unreasonable people. And Margaret Thatcher was the most unreasonable person I've ever met, but I do admire her deeply. Sometimes...
Give us an example.
I'm going to give you an example, don't worry, but I'm just saying, often when you thought she was being extremely unreasonable, she turned out to be infuriatingly right. But she could be wrong. And I remember on one occasion when I was in the Treasury, Margaret Thatcher had just come back from a trip to the United States, and she'd come back on a commercial flight, and she sat next to a very good-looking, grey-haired, very tall man. Looked a bit like Cecil Parkinson, but it wasn't Cecil Parkinson. It was someone called Lew Wasserman, who was the president of MGM, More Gutsy Movies. And during this flight, Lew Wasserman convinced Margaret Thatcher that the crowning glory, this was towards the end of her premiership, the crowning glory of her political career was going to be the state funding of film studios to be built in Rainham Marshes in Essex. And I could not believe this when she said this to me, and she announced it to me, and I said, but Prime Minister, I thought we didn't believe in subsidies to business. She looked very cold. And I said, Prime Minister, I thought we believed in controlling public expenditure and reducing taxes. And she looked at me even more annoyed. And I said to her, Prime Minister, why would we want to build film studios in Essex? There's no unemployment there. And she looked at me furious. And I got more and more desperate. And I said, Prime Minister, we'd have to build the roads in order to get to Rainham Marshes. And her eyes were really flashing anger at this point. And then in desperation, because I'm a bit of an amateur ornithologist, I promise you this is a completely true story, I said to her, Prime Minister, if we build film studios in Rainham Marshes in Essex, we'll have all the environmentalists against us because there's a very rare bird called the Brent goose that migrates through there every winter. And she looked at me and she said, you are utterly hopeless. You do not have a constructive idea in your head. All you ever say to me is no, no, no. She said, if you'd been in my government since 1979, I would have achieved nothing at all. And I said to her, took a deep breath, and I said, to her, I've ever got half the better of. I said to her, well, Prime Minister, you're always right about everything, but there's one thing you're startlingly wrong about. I've been in your government ever since 1979. Anyway, I went back to my department. I said, well, the Prime Minister's taken complete leave of her senses, but we'd better deal with this, and we better start preparing some plans to build film studios in Essex. Anyway, the next day a message came through, the Prime Minister does not want to pursue this idea. And I don't know, I remember reading a passage in the diaries of Alan Brooke, the Chief of Staff during the Second World War, who complained about how Churchill would come out with mad ideas, how he'd keep people up all night with mad ideas, and they never knew whether he was playing with them or being completely serious. And I think that may be one of the ways in which Margaret resembled Churchill, but she could be very unreasonable. But I think one of the important points about her was, you know, if you argued and argued back, provided you could get a word in edgeways, she did actually listen and change her mind.
I'm amazed that even on a commercial flight, she wasn't flanked by private secretaries and so forth. I had to sit next to a stranger.
Well, maybe he was across the arch. I wasn't there.
Well, yes. Anyway, so that's Margaret Thatcher. Who else? I mean, who are the not so? I mean, you said that she is unreasonable. Who
I
else?
said she could be. I said she could be unreasonable.
Who is also very difficult in all the times that you have been in politics?
Well, there's no doubt about that.
Well, who's that?
That would be Sir Edward Heath. Well, I mean, Ted had a Norman St. John Steve. I don't know how many people now remember Ted Heath. Norman St. John Stevens once summed him up perfectly for me. I made some comment about Ted Heath, and he said, "Ah, yes, Ted. Having a conversation with him is rather like talking to someone in the room next door." And it was true, the sort of voice would come out, and it had no connection with anything that had been said. He was, I mean, Ted was a person of courage, a person of determination. I personally think a lot of his ideas were wrong, but I remember Richard Crossman, a Labour politician, talked about the battering ram of change. He was very impressed by how Ted Heath could get through his radical policies and followed them with great determination. But he was a strange person. He was a bachelor, as you know, and I remember he once needed a lady to come with him to dinner, and she was all dressed up, the car arrived, someone came out and said, Mr. Heath is outside, and she went out, and she sat in the back of the car, and Ted sat in the front with the chauffeur. And, you know, that was sort of just...
But wasn't he a confirmed bachelor?
I wouldn't know anything more about it than what I've said.
I told you he was, of course, the father of the EEC, wasn't he? I mean, almost.
Well, he wasn't the father of the EEC. He was the man who took Britain into the EEC. People say that was partly because of his experiences of the Second World War, and as a lot of people who supported the original idea of European unification, were people who saw the horror of war during that time. He used to say, although I always found this rather difficult to believe, that he used to, as a child, he'd heard, or perhaps his parents had heard, the cannons of the First World War across the English Channel.
But explain to us or me that you said the word union, but of course at that time it wasn't the European Union, it was the European Economic Community. So where did this, if there had been a union idea, not only economy but political and social, why was it an EEC in the beginning? And when did that change into the EU?
Well, there's not a lot of argument about this, and I can only give you my view. I mean, some people would say this was always part of the original intention, people like Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, that this was what was envisaged. I do think that actually the way in which different countries approach this question is completely different. And I think different countries' attitudes to Europe are very much determined by their history in the 20th century. There was a Spanish economist, I've forgotten his name, he had a German name, but I remember he once made quite an amusing insight into this, where he said the reason the European Union exists is this. First of all, the French are afraid of the Germans. Secondly, the Germans are afraid of the Germans. The Italians don't trust themselves. The Greeks want to be Turks. The Irish want to be rid of the British. And the Portuguese and the Spaniards want to be French. And the Dutch, the Belgians and the Luxembourgers want to dine at the top table. The only thing that's left out of this analysis, which I would add, is that, and the British think they needn't have anything to do with it because they won the war all on their own. I do think there's actually something in that. It's the Greek and the Spanish and the Portuguese experience of fascism, the French and German experience of being occupied. Britain has a completely different perspective. But to go back to the decision to join, and I made my maiden speech in the House of Commons supporting our membership. I believe this was a purely economic arrangement. In the white paper that was published during the 1975 referendum, it was clearly stated that there would be no monetary union, no question of a single currency, which of course could lead on to taxation, public expenditure all being controlled by Europe. I believed that, and that was the argument that I made at the time. Fast forward a few years, and Jacques Delors suddenly comes out with his idea of creating a single currency, which of course is very difficult to operate without having a political union, without having a federal government, without having control of the budgets of each of the countries, without having control of taxation. I mean, one of the reasons I'm fundamentally opposed to being in the European Union now, unreformed, is because I think we are on a track actually to get more and more political unification. And I don't think, a lot of young people, unfortunately, have a sort of rather vague idea, well, international collaboration is better. The sort of problems of trying to operate democracy over 28 separate countries are very, very real. I mean, we only have, 8% of the votes in the European Parliament, 10% of the votes in the Council of Ministers. And we are sharing decisions with 27 other countries. I think the problem, there is no European demos, as people know, the word democracy consists of two elements: kratos, meaning power, and demos, meaning people. You need to have common values, perhaps a common language, although it's not always a question of language. I mean, the Swiss are a people, even though they have different languages within Switzerland. But France, Germany, they are peoples. But to have a democracy across 28 different countries, I think is extremely difficult. I mean, think about it this way. You could elect a prime minister of the world. He might be elected in every country, from Syria to Britain to Albania to Tasmania. But what connection would he have with every country of the world? What would he represent? What would be the common basis on which people would make their decision to vote? I think it is extremely difficult to operate and maintain a democracy over a multinational bloc of this kind.
Well, I mean, more the reason why I think it's paradoxical that the European Union started off on the basis of the economy, when in fact all the other reasons which you mentioned, generally to do with peace after the war, social conditions, political scenarios, and yet economy became the central bond that created the union, and now the economy, paradoxically, is one of the issues that is actually causing all the problems. So I don't understand that. That's why.
Well, but I think the originators of the European Union, who were Jean Monnet and Schuman, they actually saw getting rid of nation states as creating a more stable Europe. But the way in which they wanted to do this was, before the common market was founded, was through the European steel and coal community. And their argument to themselves was, if you merge the steel industry of Europe together, you can never have a war again in Europe. So I think the real Europeans always saw this as the ultimate objective of political union. There's a lot of argument about were the British people misled. I think they were misled in 1975. I was very interested. There was a program on television earlier this week. I just happened to see 5 minutes of it, but there was a bit in which Ted Heath he'd obviously been interviewed some years ago, and he was asked about political union, and he said to the camera, yes, that was always the objective, but that was never, ever what was said.
All right, well, look, listen, let's have some questions. I mean, there are plenty of questions. Okay, let's start with you. You look rather...
Just continuing the conversation, which I found fascinating so far. In terms of...
can you just speak into the mic? Then over here. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a very interesting conversation. So I just want to build on this argument around political union. Aside from those arguments, which clearly there are strong arguments around sovereignty, around democracy, do you still believe that there's a strong economic case for remaining in Europe?
I believe that in or out is rather marginal economically. For me, it is really a political issue. But I believe that Britain could survive perfectly well outside the EU. The Prime Minister himself, rather extraordinarily, said, when he made that famous speech, the Bloomberg speech, he said, it will never be part of my argument that Britain can't succeed economically outside the European Union. Of course it can. Britain is a great country. Those were his exact words. We're now being told, that plague will burst out, boils will afflict everybody's body, there'll be famine and locusts everywhere, and that the world will come to an end. I don't believe that for 1 minute. I think people talk about access to the market. The question is asked, what will be the arrangements on which Britain will trade with the EU outside the EU? Britain will trade with the EU as most other countries in the world do. There are 55 countries that have free trade agreements with the EU, even without free trade agreements. America doesn't have a free trade agreement with the EU. It actually exports, I know it's a bigger economy than ours, but it actually exports more to the EU than we do. And then people say, but it's very different with services, legal services, financial services. They export almost as much in services as we do, and they don't have the slightest say in how the rules are made. You know, these arguments are deployed all the time. You must have a say in the rules. Normally, when one country sells either goods or services to another country, they manage to sell them without actually just sell them according to the regulations and laws of that country. And then people talk about tariffs. The tariffs around the EU are by and large very low, with one or two exceptions. So I don't see that that will be a huge issue.
And also, people seem to forget the argument that what makes trade are the products and the services.
And the buyer and the seller.
And buyer and the seller. So they're not. It doesn't matter if you're in the union or not. If the product was good and it was cheaper, or rather, people will buy. And we know that. China sells to the whole world. Why? Because the things they sell are cheaper, and they sell. Walmart sells 60% of their stuff in America because it's cheap. So I always think that people forget this argument about tariffs and all these things about trade, when in fact they don't mention the most important aspect, which is the product or the services that are involved. Yes.
I was just wondering how much it's going to cost Britain to come out of the EU, and what would be the debt, you know that?
Well, I don't think there'll be any debt. Britain makes a gross contribution to the budget of the EU each year of about £20 million. It's true we get about half, or roughly half of that back in terms of EU funding of projects like agriculture or roads in remote areas of the... You've probably seen these signs that are sometimes put up at universities or alongside roads, where you get the European flag with 12 stars around it, and this has been funded, this project, by the EU. I always think that it should actually say this project was paid for by the British taxpayer, but the EU has decided to give you half your money back in the form of a project that you don't want.
Yes, Mark. Yes, Mark.
David makes the point that it's about. David makes the point that it's about price, and I entirely accept that. Then there is a question of tariffs. And the question that I'm interested to put to can you hear me, sorry? Is it coming across?
Yes. Speak a bit louder.
Okay. The point I'd like to put is this, that people talk about a possibility of a backlash amongst the member states when Britain leaves, partly exacerbated by the fact that there are probably quite a number of other countries that wouldn't mind leaving as well, and that once Britain shows the way, then you might have a breaking down. And equally on the tariff side, to get the tariff approved, in principle you need 27 countries to approve it, so it becomes quite difficult and threatening in practice.
Yeah, but don't you think that's rather a bad argument in favour of the EU? If one country leaves, we've got to treat it appallingly in order to stop other people leaving. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a very good argument for the EU, but you're absolutely right. That is what some people say. I took part in a shadow negotiation, where a war game, I believe is the correct term, where I was pretending to be David Cameron, and there were a lot of ex-EU ministers, real live EU ex-ministers, and we were negotiating what would happen to Britain after a Brexit. And the Polish former foreign minister of Poland said exactly what you've said. He said, well, we've got to be extremely hard on Britain in order to stop other countries leaving. Well, that seems to me a terrible condemnation of the EU, and actually in absolute contravention of the purpose of the EU and what the treaties say, where it says the EU should make every effort to be in good terms with its neighbours. That's what Article 3 of the Treaty of European Union says. But I don't think, even if people were very angry, and I think it would be shameful if people were angry about a vote arrived at democratically, there would be quite a period of time to calm down, because under the procedures for leaving the EU, Article 50, sorry to be rather boring about this, you have a 2-year period in which everything remains exactly the same. And the negotiation, Britain remains a member of the EU, doesn't participate in decisions about how it will be treated once it's left, but it remains a member of the EU, everything is exactly the same. So there'll be plenty of time for people to calm down. But I don't for 1 minute believe that they could impose high tariffs. Firstly, the tariffs of the EU generally, with 1 or 2 exceptions, are very low, and under the WTO rules, where you have low tariffs, you can't move in the opposite direction. The EU is bound by the WTO rules and impose higher tariffs on a country with which you have low tariffs. And in any case, when you think about it, in terms of goods, they sell much more to us than we sell to them. And even if high tariffs were possible, take the car industry. Britain is the largest purchaser of German cars. We sell some cars, but far fewer to the EU than the EU sells to
What
us.
car? Britain doesn't own any cars.
Yeah, but there are lots of cars manufactured in this country.
Are there?
Yes. Yes. Well, they're not quite from China, but they're from
Which car?
They're from your part of the world. Nissan, Toyota, Honda, Ford, Vauxhall.
Well, because they were not British.
We actually have quite a flourishing car industry.
But anyway, your war game, hypothetical war game, is nonsense, because if there was a Brexit, Cameron wouldn't be Prime Minister.
But I didn't have a placard saying Cameron. It just said Prime Minister.
All right. Any other question? Yes.
You obviously have an awful lot of experience of economic matters, and I'm very interested to hear you say actually you don't think there will be much economic impact whether Britain leaves the EU or not. I mean, the Treasury obviously has a very different view, and said this week that we're all going to be £4,300 worse off. I mean, what have they got wrong?
Well, I don't want to attack the actual document, but I would criticise the way in which it was presented. I mean, you've just said what most people got the impression was what it said. You said people would be £4,300 worse off. What the document actually says, and it says it on the basis of a whole lot of assumptions which you can muck around with and get completely different figures, but what it said was not that people would be worse off, but that people would be better off, but they would be even better off if they remained within the EU. And this was measured over 14 years, up to in the year 2030. And it was the cumulative figure over all those 14 years added up together. And the difference between the growth in the bad scenario and the growth in the good scenario remaining in was 0.3%. And so what they did was multiply 0.3 by 14, and then they get this figure of 4,300. And 4,300 was not a personal figure, it was a household figure, and it was not actually personal income. It was 4,300 to the whole economy. But 0.3%, the difference between scenario A and scenario B, spread over 14 years, 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. I mean, it's quite ludicrous. Most forecasts aren't right for 14 months, let alone 14 years. I thought it was a shoddy piece of conclusion.
But also, the basis of calculation was GDP per capita, which is not the same as your income.
It's not the same as income. It also assumed that there was zero benefits from leaving, and part of the argument is that there could be some benefits from leaving. It assumed there was zero.
So you think it's absolutely shoddy that the government should actually spend £9.5 million peddling what they claim to be the facts surrounding.
Well, I can tell you, it isn't over yet, and you've just got to get used to this. This is going to go on week after week. There'll be another Treasury document, and the Treasury document will be, the last document was about the long-term effect. Now we've got to prepare for the shock. The difference between a shock is, obviously a shock is unexpected by definition. A shock will be the short-term effect, and then we've had the long-term effect. So just be warned, there'll be another document saying, not just over 40 years, but immediately there will be a catastrophic effect. I mean, I'll tell you one thing, which this reminded me of. In 1991, when I was in government, I went off to Moscow. And when I was coming back, I stopped off in Ukraine. And Ukraine, the Prime Minister and President of Ukraine, told me they were going to separate from Russia. And they were going to have their own currency. They were going to give up the ruble. And I remember I then went on to a meeting of finance ministers in Brussels. I thought this was a terrific idea, Ukraine becoming independent, having its own currency. And I told over lunch the EU finance ministers that Ukraine was going to become an independent country, and it was going to leave the ruble zone and have its own currency. And the reaction was one of horror, absolute horror. And they said, what we must do is send a delegation from the EU to tell them that they must not destroy the single market of the Soviet Union. Exactly the argument they're putting forward now.
Yes. No? Why have you withdrawn your question? Go on, ask it. All right.
I was going to ask, what is the
Wait. Let him go, because you've asked one question, really.
I'm turning 40 this year, so I'm starting to feel nostalgic and look back to the good old days. But do you find, Lord Lamont, looking back, the politicians we have these days are not party political, but generally quite feeble? So to take an example, we have, for instance, we've had a bad experience in Iraq. Cameron then tries to go into Libya, Parliament votes against that. He then tries to go into Syria, doesn't make a mistake, now back to Libya. And then in Parliament we see things like 5p taxes on carrier bags, or taxes on pasties, or energy taxes, and then the steel industry collapses because they can't afford the steel. What are the long-term strategic thinkers that people like the Cecil Parkinsons or the Dennis Healeys or the Jeffrey Hutt, people who've died recently, whether you agreed with them or not, they had experience, they thought longer term.
Well, I'm not going to criticise the present Prime Minister. One of the things David didn't say about me, which people often bring up, is that when I was Chancellor, one of the people I had working for me was David Cameron, who was my political advisor and speechwriter, and he was brilliant. I also had William Hague as my parliamentary private secretary. I may be a lousy politician, but I think I'm quite good at choosing people. But David was very, very good working for me, and he had a wonderful sense of humour, and I had quite a rough time as Chancellor, although I think things didn't work out too badly. But I remember on one occasion, David Cameron gave me a very long mahogany box. It was literally about this long, very, very thin. You will be interested in this. And it contained the biggest Cuban cigar you could possibly imagine. And attached to it, David put a yellow note, one of those horrible yellow pieces of paper, that said, "By the time you smoke this, all your troubles will be over." Well, I never ever smoked it. I've still got it, and I'm going to send it back to him.
Will you promise? Will you promise?
No, I won't.
Go on. Will you promise?
But,
Please promise. If not, I'll send it for you.
People always say, oh, the politicians of yesteryear. But I mean, I think Dennis Healey was a marvellous man. Actually, I rather liked Dennis Healey. I went to his memorial service, and someone told a wonderful story about how when Dennis Healey went to meet Ronald Reagan, and he went, as one has to do, accompanied by the British ambassador in Washington, and they walked into the Oval Office, and Ronald Reagan walked up to Dennis Healey and said, "Good to meet you again, Mr. Ambassador," at which point Dennis Healey replied, "Very nice to meet you again, General Eisenhower." But I think this business that the politicians of today are not as good as the ones of yesteryear. You know, I think in the days of Attlee, people used to say, "Oh, it's not as great as it was with Baldwin and Balfour." And in the days of Balfour, they would say, "It's not as good as it was in the time of Disraeli and Gladstone." And you know, in the time of Disraeli and Gladstone, they said, "Oh, if only we had Canning back, everything would be fine." It's always like that.
And who are the rising stars that you might tip of today? Who is going to matter in 10 years' time, let's say, 5 or 10 years' time?
Well, I like, I don't know him very well, but I like Rory Stewart as a...
he's coming to speak very soon.
Yeah, I think he's very, very good. I think there are Dominic Raab.
He's not coming to speak.
There are a lot of very good young...
Zach Goldsmith?
Yes, he's very good. He's got a tough fight as mayor.
He's not going to win, is he? I ran up I ran up my bookie, and he's 4-1 as opposed to the other fellow who's 7-1 on. So there it is. But you also told me that for the referendum is 70-30, 70 to remain, 30 against. So Brexit is going to lose.
Well, according to, there is a divergence between the way the bookies view it. The bookies are usually right. But the way the bookies view it and the way the polls. The polls are divided, of course, between those that are done online and those the telephone polls. The telephone polls give a bigger lead to Remain. No, it's the other way around. But there's this discrepancy between online and telephone polls. You know, when you put the two together, it is quite close, but this is at odds with what the bookies are saying.
Any other question? Intelligent question? Yes.
I just wanted to talk about current politicians, and obviously the Panama Papers have exposed some light in Parliament on possible background deals, etc. Now, obviously, that's been dealt with in the House of Commons, and transparency is there with the publication of tax returns. I just wondered, should the House of Lords also be transparent and publish their tax returns?
I certainly hope not. House of Lords is a part-time assembly. You know, almost everybody has got some, you know, apart from Liberal Democrats. The Liberals are full-time, everybody else is part-time. I don't see any reason why. I mean, I think people should declare all business interests they have in a register, but I don't think one ought to. I don't see the need. I don't think tax returns are actually that illuminating. I wouldn't be in favour of it in the House of Lords. Let me say just about the Panama thing. I mean, it was interesting seeing all the lists of people throughout the world, but I thought it was pretty harsh on David Cameron and pretty harsh on his father. And I thought it must have been a dreadful experience for him to suddenly see his father, who died quite recently, or for his mother to see her dead husband flashing up on television with all these allegations. What was clear from the beginning, but people didn't sort of seem to give it any weight, was that the trust, which was a fund, not for his family alone, but for, you know, it was an investment fund for investors, and it was registered with the tax authorities in this country. And so Mr. Cameron Sr. obviously paid all the taxes that were due on that. And, you know, that was the case with David Cameron as well. You know, I thought it was crystal clear that neither Mr. Cameron Sr. nor Mr. Cameron Jr. had done anything wrong whatsoever. But, you know, that
It's
wasn't...
perception, isn't it?
Mm.
It's perception. And it's very interesting to me that there aren't very many American names. And I'm sure it's a CIA job. I mean, to get all those people saying, there's no American names. It's very, very strange. Yes, yes.
I have two questions. The first one is, you were talking about the trust that the father of Mr. Cameron was declaring whatever has to be declared. What's the point of having a trust and if you have to declare and pay tax? This is my first question.
Can I answer the first question first? Well, the trust was not a family trust. It was an investment fund. And Mr. Cameron's father was a professional fund manager. He worked for a very well-known firm of stockbrokers, and the fund was created for different people to invest in. He happened to put some of his own money into it. It wasn't a very good investment, by the way, but he put some of his own money into it, but it was for other investors to invest in. And the reason it was in Panama was presumably because a lot of the other people who were going to invest in it were people who had no connection with the UK and didn't want to have any connection with the UK because they would be liable for tax in the UK. That is a legitimate purpose of an offshore trust, to be a vehicle for people who are outside your tax jurisdiction and who may be living in another country.
In fact, the word trust, I think,
It's completely misleading.
It is misleading and has been rectified now by law. There are certain things you can't call it a trust unless it satisfies certain conditions. But Norman's right. It was a fund rather than it was a professional fund rather than a family trust as such. Yeah.
Your second question, Mary Claire?
And the second question is, if Great Britain goes out of the EU, what do you think it might change in the status of the non-domicile, or would it not affect?
I don't think it would affect it.
All right.
So don't worry.
You're talking about non-domicile.
Yes.
Well, I thought it was going to disappear anyway. Isn't that right?
I think the income tax authorities would like to abolish. I'm sure this is not of remote interest to people in this room. I can see one or two people. Funny enough, when I was at the Treasury, I'll confess to you, I considered abolishing it.
For hereditary purposes. I mean,
Yes.
Yeah.
But I remember we were preparing a consultation document about it, putting the pros and cons of retaining. It is a very unique concept to Britain, non-domicile. People living abroad and saying, but or living in Britain saying, I don't really belong here, I'm going to be buried in the New Hebrides or the Falklands, or, that's where my heart really is. And I did consider looking at this. This was not when I was Chancellor, but when I was a junior minister in the Treasury. And we did a hell of a lot of work on it. But we hadn't told Mrs. Thatcher. And one day I just got a note saying, stop it. And I gathered that was because she'd met a lot of Greek ship owners, and they had made it very clear they didn't. It was sometimes with Margaret you would just be told to drop it. I remember I once wanted to examine the budget of the intelligence services. I thought they had rather too much money, and I didn't approve of this. It's now come into existence, this wonderful new office they have on the south side of the Thames, and I thought
the MI6.
Yes, I thought this was a terrible waste of money, and I submitted a long letter to the Prime Minister saying why we should cut the expenditure, and the letter came back unopened.
But there's one question I always wanted to ask somebody like you, who was a Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, is it possible at all for any normal human being, fairly intelligent, doesn't even have to be stupid, but fairly intelligent, to be able to cope with all the laws governing taxes that comes out of HMRC, that every citizen is supposed to be able to understand and fill in? I mean, when you were Chancellor, were you not astonished how complicated everything was?
Yes, absolutely. And I was for a long time the Financial Secretary in the Treasury, and I was dealing just with direct taxation, not with indirect taxation. And I used to dread, you have these little boxes full of papers that you take home at night, and you would get something you had to read at 11 o'clock at night and make a decision on, the structure of petroleum revenue tax. 30 pages of type stuff. I think we've gone far too far in the complexity of the tax system. Of course, it reflects to some extent the sophistication of professional advisors.
You feed them.
But it's not just them following the tax system. It's also the tax system following some of the very artificial devices that.
But the more complicated you make.
But the answer to I believe in a simple tax system, and I think we have failed to do that. But I think we ought to have a moratorium on an awful lot of tax legislation. Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson did do quite a bit to simplify the tax system. I think it was a lot simpler when they left office. Gordon Brown, I think, made it a lot more complicated. When you say, can anyone understand it, obviously a minister is not going to understand every aspect of the tax system. He's only going to understand the broad principles of it, and he will only be asked to make decision on changes, which are probably going to be at the margin.
But I think all of you living in Treasury are living in dreamland, because you don't make the distinction between cash flow and P&L, if you see what I mean. The amount of taxes you're going to raise and the amount of taxes you're going to collect, and there's so much back taxes and so forth, and it's just so complicated. In Hong Kong, you fill in your form, it asks you 3 questions. Have you moved? Are you still with the same employer? Signature, and that's it, 15% finish.
Well, I think the rule ought to be that, that the tax system is so simple that everybody could fill in their tax return without an accountant. That seems to me how the tax system should be.
Sorry, I've been hogging. A question? Yes. You and then you again.
I'm old enough to remember the ERM situation. I'm just wondering what you think you might have done differently, and also what were the constraints at the time that prevented you from doing that, and maybe what was the role of the Prime Minister at the time's influence on that?
Well, how long have you got? Another hour? The answer is I wouldn't do anything different, because I couldn't have done anything different. I don't know how many, the ERM experience was quite a long time ago, 1992. I'm not sure everybody in this room will remember it, but it was a fixed exchange rate system, which we broke out of in 1992. I didn't participate in the decision to join the exchange rate mechanism. It was a decision I inherited. When I was asked to become Chancellor, I didn't sit down and think, should I be Chancellor of the Exchequer because we're in the exchange rate mechanism? It didn't occur to me that this was going to cause enormous difficulty. Britain had been in fixed exchange rate systems before. It was in the Bretton Woods system that lasted for decades. Never occurred to me that just because I'd become Chancellor of the Exchequer, it was suddenly going to become very, very difficult in the exchange rate mechanism. But what happened with the exchange rate mechanism, whereby our exchange rate and our interest rates were linked to the other countries of Europe, was that the conditions in Germany became quite the opposite of those in Britain. Germany was reunited. This created a huge boom in Germany, which meant that German interest rates had to be raised. And Britain at that time was in recession. We needed lower interest rates. So you had this extraordinary tension between rising rates in Germany and falling rates in the UK. And the markets began to see that this was a untenable position. I went to, well, before I say, let me just say, I never believed in the ERM, as some people did, as a sort of pathway to the single currency. I was always totally opposed to the single currency. I saw it just as a fixed exchange rate mechanism, which also was going to help us to get inflation down. When I became Chancellor, inflation was nearly 12%. The day I left being Chancellor, it was on the path down to be under 2%. So in that sense, the exchange rate mechanism worked. And one of the reasons people wanted to join was as a counter-inflation weapon. I always say about the ERM that it was a tool that filled its counter-inflationary purpose, but it was a tool that disintegrated in my hands. And it was a tool that became inappropriate because in the second year when I was Chancellor, it was quite obvious inflation was coming down. And yet we were maintaining these very high interest rates that were having a bad effect on the economy. And I did go twice to John Major and suggested to him that we should suspend our membership of it until the situation in Germany sorted itself out. And he didn't want to do that. And so I had no alternative but to continue with the policy. And then September the 16th, 1992, what people call Black Wednesday, White Wednesday, Britain left the ERM. Well, one of the things that always interests me is people say Britain left the ERM. They seem to have no conception that other countries left the ERM on the same day. We weren't even the first country to devalue. Italy devalued before us. Ireland devalued. Several countries devalued twice. We decided just to float, remain outside. They decided to float and then reform the ERM a bit later. But you know, I think the ERM was a painful experience, but I think it was actually beneficial in terms of getting inflation dramatically down. And the boom that followed in the succeeding years was not just a consequence of getting out of the ERM, it was a consequence of becoming much more competitive and the lowering of inflation from 12% to it was the first time we'd ever had inflation below the level of Germany. So I would say, as the Governor of the Bank of England said at the time, we benefited, actually, painful it was, from being in, but it became inappropriate to remain in, and we benefited from getting out. That would be my take on it. But there was nothing else I could have done. I inherited the policy, I suggested that maybe we should suspend it, but there it was.
And yet that policy brought about the single currency.
No, it didn't bring about the single currency.
It was on the way. I mean, the principle was the same about federal interest.
No, doesn't follow. You know, the exchange rate mechanism was a system of linking currencies together, but it was an adjustable system. You could devalue within it, and several countries over the 70s and 80s, well, in the 70s, did devalue within the system. It was no doubt seen by people who supported, supported the idea of the ERM, was no doubt of the euro, was no doubt seen by them as a pathway to it. But there were other people, like Nigel Lawson. Nigel Lawson believed in the ERM, but he did not ever believe in the euro. He just believed in it as a counter-inflationary mechanism. His thinking was that if you locked the Deutschmark to sterling, the much higher inflation rate of sterling would eventually converge.
Yes, but that's, you're assuming you're talking about different currencies. By the time the currency was single, then the interest rate matters. I mean, to everybody.
But I think the ERM, William Hague put it very, very well. He said, being in the ERM became a bit like a burning building, but being in the euro is being like in a burning building and the doors are locked. You can't get out.
That's my point.